garroted, not because he fears the flames, but because it is vitally important to him that his body is preserved so that it can be mummified and held in reverence by his descendants, as have those of all previous Inca emperors. Thus dies the last Inca emperor of an independent empire at just the age of 31. Inca autonomy is never fully recovered from that point on. Empire was very hard to get into the cemented the century between Inca democracy and royalty. Once they dissipated, the strange development Spaniards quickly established control and dominance. They quickly put the Inca and Spanish society, culture, and empire into the region.
对，真的不要跟我敲地上，真的不要跟我敲地上。
Atahualpa has often been portrayed as naive. That the Spaniards have laid for him. But if you think about it, it wasn't really naive or foolish at all. What would have been foolish would have been to attack these strangers when nothing was known about them, little real conversation had been had with them, and it wasn't clear who they were or where they came from. The very concept of people coming from outside those regions was alien to the Incas, and this is what made the judgment call that Atahualpa had to make so very, very difficult. It was impossible for him to know what Francisco Pizarro and his men represented or whether they were a threat. They clearly had some potent weapons. There were only a few of them. They didn't seem terribly threatening. After the death of Atahualpa, the Spaniards need to find a replacement. They still need an Inca emperor. The Inca Empire still exists. The number of Spaniards in Peru is still very, very low. There's very few of them, just a few hundred. So they have to have an emperor through whom to govern. And they actually end up appointing a series of figures for this role. They're known as the puppet emperors. And the first, and in many respects the most important, is a man called Manco Inca. So Manco Inca is another son of the previous Inca emperor Huayna Capac. So he is an Inca prince of the blood. And he's chosen by the Spaniards to play this role of being a puppet Inca.
With Manco Inca installed as their puppet leader, the Spaniards established Cusco as their inland base. Great hunks of their terrain were confiscated, their treasure plundered, the Inca unable to hold back a merciless Spanish force. Pizarro undoubtedly owed much of his brutal success to a surprising form of European weaponry.
There's a question to the extent to which military technology, military tactics helped the conquistadors succeed in Peru and other parts of the Americas. One weapon that isn't written about nearly as much in these stories, in part because they didn't have the prestige of the horse, is the importance of dogs that the Spanish brought along with them in these battles. Spanish Mastiffs, these huge dogs with powerful jaws, are even now a highly valued breed that's associated with being in the nobility and the aristocracy in Spain even now.
Adorned with spiked collars and padded jackets, the war dogs had been trained to attack natives whilst protecting the Spanish. Fed chunks of human meat, they would ravenously chomp through bone, having been starved in preparation for a fight. These enormous hounds may have terrified the Inca, but at least they could see the great slobbering beasts sent to track and kill them. Once again, the merciless spread of European viruses proved to be the conquistadors' closest ally.
The reason that Nazi the Spaniards, other Europeans, or enslaved Africans they brought along with them, why they didn't seem to die in these greater numbers when these epidemics broke out is because many of them had already had these diseases as children or as adolescents, and so had some acquired immunity, not an inborn immunity, but an acquired immunity through their experience living in diseased societies.
The impact of disease is arguably even more serious than in the case of Mexico, and this is because an old world disease, again possibly smallpox, actually reaches the Inca Empire some years in advance of the conquistadors themselves. These virgin soil epidemics move so swiftly through Native American populations, down into Ecuador and ultimately into the Inca Empire itself, some years in advance of the Europeans.
It was a perfect set of circumstances for the conquistadors. Not only did they enjoy the advantage of superior weaponry, but they also possessed a biological upper hand. By 1535, the shrines and temples of Cusco had been stripped of their gold and silver. Pizarro needed easy access to the ocean so that this loot could be sent back to the Old World. So shifts his army 350 miles west to establish the permanent capital city of Lima on the coast. Bitter resentment flowed through the surviving Inca, who began to form a resistance.
The Spaniards become more and more confident in their position in Peru, and in 1536 to 37, Manco Inca decides that he's had enough, and he stages what's known as the Great Rebellion. They lay siege to Cusco, they lay siege to Lima. This Great Rebellion is by far and away the closest the Incas ever come to actually driving the Spaniards from Peru altogether. One of the things you can see during Manco Inca's Great Rebellion is the ways in which the Incas have already begun to adapt to the new situation. They seek to deal with the horses, for example, by digging pits and trenches with stakes in them with the hope of breaking the legs of the horses or otherwise disabling them and taking them out of combat. The fact that the Spaniards have far greater technology, the fact that they can call on reinforcements from over the sea, the fact that the Inca population has been devastated by disease as well as by the civil war and by conquest means that this movement fails.
Manco Inca flees Cusco with his queen, Cura Occhio, in an attempt to establish a new, independent Inca state. But in the chaos, the Spaniards managed to take her captive. She would have known that the Spanish were frequently willing to employ sexual violence as a weapon of war and an expression of power.
This is a part of the conquest that's part and parcel of the warfare itself. It is one of the most important stories, one of the dominant stories of the conflict, chaos, and violence of this era. In order to prevent violent abuse by her male captors, Cura Occhio covered herself in disgusting, despicable things to translate. Her own excrement, something else, who knows, but she successfully prevented her rape and abuse all the way until she arrived in Cusco, where she was executed.
Despite the trauma of losing his wife to the conquistadors, Manco Inca successfully established his own state in Vilcabamba, part of modern-day Ecuador. For 35 battle-worn years, he and his successors resisted the Spanish invaders. Meanwhile, discontent was spreading amongst the conquistadors. Pizarro's habit of awarding huge encomiendas to members of his own family was causing division and resentment amongst the Spanish adventurers. Pizarro was gaining some dangerous enemies. Despite Spanish infighting, in 1572, Manco Inca's stronghold finally fell. This was the end of the Inca resistance and the opening of a new chapter of prolonged, catastrophic subjugation.
I
I think we can state confidently that peoples numbered in the millions in the Inca Empire proper. To be more specific than that is quite difficult. And it's also just as difficult to estimate how many people were dying from disease, from particular battles, from the famines and the disruption and the robberies and other aspects of chaos that these wars unleashed. We can state with some confidence what happened over the longer term. Over the course of the whole 16th century, at least 70%, perhaps over 90% depopulation. At the same time, you have all these increasing numbers of immigrants who come from other parts of the Americas, who come from Europe itself, slaves that they brought along from these regions, and then the children that they began having with the handful of women that they brought along with them as also as immigrants, but also with
我要前面打過嚟㗎，跟住普落自
themselves.
敗。去 fuck brain。
Mines heaving with gold and silver dotted the
伸出嚟
Peruvian
啊！哦，自
landscape.
敗當面都。
Spain's focus, through its conquistadors, would shift. Their revised mission, an aggressive assault on South America's precious
真的
metals,
真的有辦
tearing
法
them
伸出
from
這
the
種自敗
ground
嘅狗
on
啊
an！industrial scale.
突然成賣嚟，this is just boring and
This
stupidity
change
打你真
from
嘅。
extracting treasure and human lives to extracting nature itself.
真的。
Beginning for one of the things that the Andean nations are known for even now, turning them into some of the most important mineral producers in the world. I can't emphasize enough how important, first of all, the mining of treasure, but then the establishing of mines themselves, most famously the Red Mountain, almost a mountain of silver in Potosi, what's now Bolivia, in changing the sheer amount of bullion that's available to pay payments in the world economy.
The wealth that came back from Peru were, if possible, even greater than the first wave of wealth that actually arrived in Spain from Mexico. In some ways, it's going to lead to actually the depopulation in many areas of the Americas, where Spaniards are going to want to abandon their place of residence and go to Peru because they're hearing of all the wealth that exists in Peru and they want to be part of it.
The impoverished boy from Estremadura had conquered an empire. But on June 26, 1541, a disgruntled group of rogue conquistadors broke into his home and stabbed him to death. By dominating Peru and its people, Pizarro had seemingly added nearly 800,000 square miles of territory to King Charles's empire. But the quest hadn't been swift, and it hadn't been easy. And the Inca were far from beaten.
哇！真的全部是狗生出來的反對啊！今天
were not
反
totally
對反對
defeated
咧，真的。
for decades. Not until the 1570s. A lot of the fighting was what we would call guerrilla warfare. Indigenous groups who were fighting against the conquistadors became amazingly adept at causing a lot of damage to their foes with a very small number of soldiers at their disposal. One of the important things to keep in mind too is this is one of the most rugged regions in the world. There are so many places that you can hide. There are so many strong points that one can defend for a long period. If you've ever been to Machu Picchu, that gives you some sense of how rugged and densely vegetated these landscapes were and how difficult it would be for not just an individual but for entire armies to move around.
Despite this heroic resistance, years of Spanish occupation eventually turned into decades. With grim inevitability, Inca society and culture gave way to Spanish influence. Their once great civilization transforming irreversibly. The Inca was the last ever indigenous empire of its kind, Its conquest would open the Americas up to the ravenous greed of Europe, forcing the conquistadors to find a way to retain control. Colonization, their culture inextricably woven into the living, ever-evolving ecosystems of the New World. But as generations passed, a bleak set of racial hierarchies began to form. Whilst the mining of a seemingly endless supply of silver would bring the colonists a new level of wealth, catapulting the conquistadors to the apex of their powers, and sending them into the wilderness hunting for more, seizing the Philippine Islands, bringing them into contact with a tribe of 10-foot women, and discovering the largest river on the planet.
check 什么？steering wheel， 哇，鸡掰不是有power steering 哦，哇 ，my goodness gracious me，this is unbelievable，this is bordering on stupid every time。有冇搞錯啊，大佬得唔得啊？快啲啊！ very slow. Bordering on the useless retardation. John C.